Welcome back, everyone, to Neil Oliver Live. Joining me tonight is a South African politician, trades union leader and businessman who was instrumental in the fight against the apartheid regime and the ultimately successful campaign to secure the release of Nelson Mandela. More recently, Jay Naidoo has spoken out against the silencing, censorship and bullying that went hand in hand with the response to COVID-19. In fact, he has said the tactics applied against populations were a greater threat to freedom than the apartheid he dedicated all those years to fighting. Jay Naidoo joins me now. Good evening, Jay. Are you there? Great, there you are.
Yes, yeah. Good evening to you, Neil, and it's great to be with you and your show.
Great to see you. Tell me, first of all, Jay, when and why you decided to speak out against all that was being done in the name of COVID?
Well, I think we were all stunned by the response because, coronavirus is not a new virus. We've had many types of coronaviruses in the past. But I think the most important event was in June of 2021, my wife, who is Canadian, a journalist by profession, her mum had the Pfizer vaccine. And in the first shot, she had a heart attack. And the second shot, she ended up in hospital, not able to walk, to eat, to bath herself or take care of herself. And she was a very active person. So my wife, who lives in South Africa with me, had to take 7 months off to go and take care of her mother, who was going to be put in a state-run hospice. And she nursed her back to health. But the extraordinary thing was in the consultation with the doctor who was treating her, the doctor said that the probable cause of her heart attack was the vaccine, but he was too scared to put that on the report. And the question we had, if a doctor can lose his license because he's telling the truth, what has medicine become? And so as we studied the events that followed that, what we saw in the pandemic response from our leaders was a campaign of fear, of censorship, of guilt, of shame, with doctors losing their license for talking about the Hippocratic oath of not doing any harm to their patients, of putting their patients first. We saw workers being dismissed in South Africa because they refused to be vaccinated. We saw social media censoring journalists and anyone that contradicted the official narrative. And, I have been a victim of apartheid, so institutionalized racism, which we forever ended in 1994 with the election of President Nelson Mandela. So at 4 years old, I was evicted from my home because I was the wrong color on the wrong side of the street. So I became a freedom fighter. And I've been an activist all my life. And what I'm seeing here is something on a grander scale than even what we faced under apartheid. That in a sense, our governments, many of them have been bought out. The media, the official mainstream media, are too terrified and become a mouthpiece of Big Pharma. We find the medical regulators being compromised largely because of funding that comes from Big Pharma. And we're having tremendous vaccine injuries all around us. Every family, I'm sure, will talk about some incident. And so what we then have is a vaccine that does not give you immunity, does not stop transmission, and where there's data rising, mounting in our families, in our societies, and we are saying we are not prepared to pause and allow an independent study of the data. And so this is what makes me fearful, because I'm an elder now. I'm a grandfather. And I want to know that when I get up in the morning, I'm leaving a better world for my grandchildren and for those that are unborn. So I think the bottom line is that the litany of challenges you presented, these are perilous challenges. And the freedoms that we have sacrificed so much for across many generations, the democracy, the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, the freedom to stand up and organize ourselves. All of these are being undermined. And so, yes, I am convinced that what we are facing today is a challenge of an apartheid on a grand scale globally. And I think we should take note of what people like Asim are saying, what other prestigious physicians, people that have spent their lives at Stanford University, or like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya or Professor Martin Kulldorff, these are not street vendors. These are eminent physicians who are saying and calling on the medical profession and the WHO to pause. So we have no emergency now. Can we look at the data and can we put the people that have been negatively affected through vaccine injuries in the spotlight and show some compassion to them, which has been the core of what we fought for in freedom in South Africa?
Jay, what you say is so compelling. How do we reclaim what we have lost? You know, you've got a lifetime of experience. You know, you've written most recently about watching communities torn apart by the restrictions that were put in place in regards to COVID-19. How do we get beyond this and reclaim what we've lost?
We need to restore a conversation, Neil. We need to not talk past each other and understand that there's no absolute science. There are many sciences in the room. There are indigenous sciences. There are medical sciences that have been evolved, that have treated thousands of patients. I wrote an op-ed on a doctor who had 14,000 patients. His name is Dr. Shankara Chetty. He works in a rural area. 14,000 patients, no hospitalization, no oxygen, no deaths, and no vaccine. Now, why are we ignoring him? Now, he's one of the doctors is facing disciplinary action for saving lives. They want to take away his medical license.
On this show, Jay, I've had Shankara Chetty on here. You know, I've spoken to Shankara at length, and yes, been similarly overwhelmed by the credibility and the weight of what he had to say. Bear with me, Jay, while I've got Asim here with me, and also Narinder Kaur here in the studio. Asim, how do you respond? How do you feel listening to a figure like Jay Naidu saying what he just said?
Well, Jay carries so much experience and wisdom. I mean, what he says is very powerful. I think any rational person sitting and listening to Jay, I think is going to be moved by that and is going to hopefully start thinking critically. I think he's absolutely right. We have to face the facts head on. We have to, instead of polarization, we have to try and create the conditions so people can have conversations. But we also have to acknowledge certainly the people who I would call the awakened lot, the people who have looked at all of this, you know, in a dispassionate way. I think we have to also understand, Neil, that what's got us to this situation in the first place initially started from a place of fear. Okay, so only a few weeks ago, Isabel Oakeshott's expose on the front page of the Telegraph, you know, Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages, we have to frighten the pants off the public. What that tells us is, of course, is that when people are under a state of considerable fear, two things happen. One is they're more likely to be controlled and they lose their capacity to engage in critical thinking, and that even applies to doctors.
Yeah.
You then get it exacerbated by all these powerful commercial vested interests that want to exploit the situation, because that's what commercial entities do. I mean, I've come up with this new term in describing how Big Pharma operates often in terms of making money, fulfills criteria for psychopathy. Yeah. So we call it, and that can explain where we are. But I think we have to have these conversations.
Yes. You hear that, Jay? Asim there reiterating the necessity to, as you say, to have this conversation. Jay, I've run out of time. I cannot express to you really adequately how grateful I am for having had the opportunity to hear you speak. You know, and you know, none wiser in a situation like this. So, 1,000 thanks for your time this evening, and I hope we will speak again at greater length. Still to come in the final part of Neil Oliver